Is it easier to drive? Is it harder to drive? I don't know! Hello, and welcome back. If you're anything like me, you'll want to be driving the best car you possibly can. To do this in ACC, often you've got to play with a setup. There's loads and loads of settings you can change in ACC. The first ones you often want to have a go at are the electronics. Now the traction control and ABS levels are pretty self-explanatory once you've figured out which side's more and which side's less. But the one that's done my nut in the most is the ECU maps. How many settings? What on earth do they mean? 1, 2, 3? What does it mean? Do they drink the petrol? Do they make it good for driving? Does it make the car faster? Does it make the car slower? Is it easier to drive? Is it harder to drive? I don't know! Anyway, I decided to do some research and find out what on earth they meant. Coming up is a full list of all the cars and all of the settings. Most of the cars seem to be different, so if you want to find out what one particular car's settings are, I've put links in the description to each individual car. Let's find out what these numbers mean for driving your car. First up, the Aston Martin Vantage GT3 cars. They have 8 different settings, 1 to 4 are dry maps. 1 being the fastest, highest level of fuel consumption, 2 the normal level of fuel consumption, but an aggressive throttle map. 3 is a bit slower than 1, a normal fuel consumption, but with a progressive throttle map. Number 4 has even less fuel consumption and a progressive throttle map. Settings 5 to 7 are for wet maps. 5 is similar to the dry 2 and 3 maps, with a normal fuel consumption with a slightly progressive throttle map. 6 is a bit slower, with less fuel consumption and a progressive wet throttle map. 7 is identical to 6, but with an even more progressive throttle map. 8, very slow map with very low fuel consumption. Both of the Audi R8 GT3s in game. 1 to 4 are again dry maps, 1 being the fastest high fuel consumption setting, 2 and 3 a bit slower, normal fuel consumption with 2 different throttle maps. 4 is the slowest with less fuel consumption and the same throttle map as 3. 5 through 7 are wet maps. 5 is the fastest map with normal fuel consumption and a slightly wet throttle map. 6 and 7 are a bit slower maps with less fuel consumption and 2 different wet throttle maps. 8 is a pace car setting again, very slow, very low fuel consumption. The Bentleys 2016 and 18. 1 to 4 are dry maps again. First again the fastest, highest fuel consumption. 2 and 3 are a bit slower with normal fuel consumption, and again the variant throttle maps of aggressive and progressive. 4 is the slowest, lowest fuel consumption with the same throttle map as 3. 5 to 7 are wet throttle maps. 5 is a fast wet map, normal fuel consumption with a slightly wet throttle map. 6 and 7 are a bit slower with less fuel consumption and 2 different throttle maps, 1 aggressive, 1 progressive. 8 again is a pace car map, very slow, very low fuel consumption. The BMW M6. Settings 1 to 3 are dry maps. The first is very high fuel consumption and a very aggressive throttle map. 2 and 3 are a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, 1 with a linear throttle map, 1 with a gradual throttle map. 4 is reserved for engineers. Don't use it, it's got very, very low power. 5 is the pace car fuel consumption map, low power, low fuel consumption. Settings 6 to 8 are the wet maps. 6 is the fastest fuel consumption with a wet throttle map. 7 and 8 are a bit slower with normal fuel consumption and 2 different wet throttle maps. The Ferrari 488 GT3 has 12 levels. 1 to 4 are dry maps. 1 being the fastest normal fuel consumption, 2 a bit slower, less fuel consumption, 3 a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, 4 slowest with lowest fuel consumption, 5 to 8 are wet maps. 5. Fastest normal fuel consumption with a wet throttle map, less linear, more gradual. 6 is a bit slower, less fuel consumption with a wet throttle map. 7. A bit slower again, normal fuel consumption with a wet throttle map. 8. Slowest, lowest fuel consumption with a wet throttle map. 9 to 12 are reserved and pace car levels and very low power maps and low consumption for pace car situations. Both the Honda NSXs in-game. 1 to 4 are dry maps. 1. Full power, progressive throttle map. 2. Full power, linear throttle map. 3. Full power, aggressive throttle map. 4. Full power, very aggressive throttle map. 5 and 6 are wet throttle maps. 5. Full power, progressive throttle map. 6. Full power, more progressive throttle map. 7. Less power and consumption, progressive throttle map. 8. Pace car, very slow map and low consumption for pace car situations. The Jaguar has 6 levels. 1 to 3 are dry maps. Fastest, very high fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 2. A bit slower, normal fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 3. Slower, less fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 4 to 6 are wet maps. 4 is the fastest, very high fuel consumption, wet, gradual throttle map. 5 a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, wet, gradual throttle map. 6 slower, less fuel consumption, a wet, gradual throttle map. The Lamborghini Gallardo RX4 has 4 dry maps. Setting 1 is the highest fuel consumption. Setting 2, a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, aggressive throttle map. Setting 3, identical to 2, progressive throttle map. Setting 4 is the slowest, lowest fuel consumption with the same throttle map as 3. The Lamborghini Huracan GT3 and the Lamborghini Huracan GT3 Evo both have 8 ECU levels. 1 to 4 are dry maps. 1, the fastest, highest fuel consumption. 2 and 3 are a bit slower, normal fuel consumption with 2 different throttle maps. 4, the slowest, less fuel consumption, same throttle map as 3. 5 to 7 are wet maps. 5, the fastest map, normal fuel usage with a slightly wet throttle map. 6 and 7 a bit slower map with less fuel consumption and 2 wet throttle maps. 8 is a pace car, very slow map, low consumption. The Lexus RC F GT3 has 5 maps. 1 is the fastest, high fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 2 is identical to 1 but has an aggressive throttle map. 3 is identical to 1 but has a progressive throttle map. 4. Fuel saving with a wet throttle map. 5 is a pace car, very slow map with low fuel consumption. The Mclaren 650S GT3 has 9 levels. 1 to 4 dry maps. 1, the fastest, normal fuel consumption. 2, a bit slower, less fuel consumption. 3, a bit slower, normal fuel consumption. 4, slowest, lowest fuel consumption. 5 to 8 are wet maps. 5, fastest, normal fuel consumption, wet throttle map. 6, a bit slower, less fuel consumption, wet throttle map. 7, a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, wet throttle map. 8, slowest, lowest fuel consumption, wet throttle map. 9 is reserved and pace car level, very low power maps and low consumption. The McLaren 720S GT3 has 12 levels. 1 to 6 are dry maps. 1 is qualifying fastest aggressive throttle map with high fuel consumption. 2 is race 1, a bit slower, linear throttle, normal fuel consumption. 3 is race 2, a bit slower, progressive throttle map and a bit less fuel consumption. 4, Race 1, fuel save map, less power, linear throttle map, low fuel consumption. 5, Race 2, fuel save map, even less power, linear throttle map, even lower fuel consumption. 6, Race 3, fuel save map, lowest power, linear throttle map, lowest fuel consumption. And 7 is a high temperature, very low power, very high consumption, to cool off the engine in emergency situations. 8 and 9 are damp condition maps. 8, damp qualifying, progressive throttle, high fuel consumption. 9, damp race, fuel save map, less power, progressive throttle map, low fuel consumption. 10 to 12 are wet condition maps. 10, wet qualifying, wet throttle map, high fuel consumption. 11, wet race 1, bit slower, wet throttle map, normal fuel consumption. 12, wet race 2, a bit slower, wet throttle map, normal fuel consumption. The Mercedes AMG GT3 has 3 throttle maps. 1, fastest high fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 2, a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 3, slow, low fuel consumption, linear throttle map. The Nissan GT-R GT3 2016 and 18 has 4 map levels. 1, the fastest high fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 2, a bit slower, normal fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 3, slower, less fuel consumption, linear throttle map. 4, fuel saving, linear throttle map. And finally, the Porsche 991 GT3R has 10 throttle maps. 1, normal power and consumption, least progressive throttle map. 2, normal power and consumption, progressive throttle map. 3, normal power and consumption, aggressive throttle map. 4, normal power and consumption, linear throttle map. 5, quali power, high consumption, least progressive throttle map. 6, quali power, high consumption, progressive throttle map. 7, quali power, high consumption, aggressive throttle map. 8, quali power, high consumption, linear throttle map. 9, low power, low consumption, progressive throttle map. 10 is a pace car map, very slow and very low consumption. I hope that's helped someone out there. It certainly helped me going through all those settings. I have a rough idea of what's going on now. If it's helped you out, let me know, leave a comment below. If you've liked the video, please leave a like. If you've really liked it, consider subscribing, and bye for now.